It was Thanksgiving night, November 28th, a chilly Thursday in Los Angeles. My name is Nicole, and like many families across the city, we gathered around the dining table, soaking in the warmth of food and family. The scent of roasted turkey and pumpkin pie filled the air, blending with laughter and the clink of dishes. My mom had outdone herself this year. Her stuffing was perfect, and even my picky little brother Max couldn't stop eating. Dad was mid-joke when a loud, urgent knock shattered the moment. It wasn't a polite knock, but heavy, almost rattling the door. We all froze. We weren't expecting anyone. Dad set down his fork, frowning. "Who could that be?" Mom whispered. "I'll get it," Dad said, pushing back his chair. Max watched, wide-eyed, from his seat next to me. I held my breath as Dad opened the door. Standing there was an old man, bundled in a ragged coat. His face was gaunt, his cheeks hollow, and his beard scraggly. He looked frail, like he hadn't eaten in days. "Please," he said, his voice raspy. "I haven't eaten in 2 days. I'm homeless and don't know where else to go." My heart sank. He looked so pitiful, standing there in the cold. Mom joined Dad at the door, exchanging a silent look, the kind that says everything without words. "We can't just leave him out there," Mom said softly. Dad nodded reluctantly. "All right, come in," he told the man, stepping aside. The man shuffled inside, smiling faintly, almost sheepishly. He seemed harmless, just another soul down on his luck. Mom set a plate for him, and he sat down, hunched over as if he didn't belong. We returned to our seats, but the atmosphere wasn't the same. I kept glancing at the man as he ate, his hands trembling as he shoveled food into his mouth like he hadn't eaten in years. For a while, we sat in silence, letting him eat. Then, far in the distance, we heard a police siren. In Los Angeles, that wasn't unusual, but something about the way the man stiffened caught my attention. His hands froze mid-bite, and his entire demeanor changed. The faint smile he had worn vanished, replaced by something darker. His eyes darted toward the door. "What's wrong?" Mom asked cautiously. The man didn't respond. Instead, he reached into his coat, and before we realized what was happening, he pulled out a gun. My blood ran cold. He pointed it at us, his voice low but commanding. "Nobody moves. Nobody opens that door." The room went silent. Dad slowly raised his hands, trying to calm him. "We don't want any trouble." "Quiet," the man barked, his tone sharp and menacing. He wasn't the frail, helpless man we had let in. This was someone dangerous. My heart pounded so loudly I feared he could hear it. Under the table, Mom squeezed my hand tightly. Max wasn't at the table. He had gone to the bathroom before the man revealed his true colors. I prayed he would stay hidden. The siren grew louder. The man's eyes flickered toward the door, his grip on the gun tightening. "If anyone makes a sound," he growled, "I'll—" Before he could finish, there was a soft creak from the hallway. My heart sank. Maximum. The man's head snapped toward the noise. I couldn't see Max, but I hoped he had the sense to stay hidden. The man seemed agitated, torn between us and the noise. Then we heard a faint click, the front door. Max must have managed to open it. The man's face twisted in fury. He bolted toward the door. "No!" he yelled, but it was too late. He flung the door open and froze. Standing there were 2 police officers, guns drawn. "Drop it!" one of them shouted. The man hesitated, his hand twitching as though he was deciding whether to shoot or run. But the officers didn't give him a chance. They moved in quickly, wrestling him to the ground. The gun clattered out of his reach. The man cursed as they cuffed him. I finally exhaled, realizing I had been holding my breath. Max peeked out from the hallway, his face pale but determined. One of the officers noticed him and gave a reassuring nod. "Good job, kid," he said. After they hauled the man away, one of the officers stayed behind to talk to us. "You're lucky," he said. "This guy's been targeting families on Thanksgiving. He robbed a family a few streets down tonight, held them at gunpoint during dinner. They called us after he left, and we've been tracking him since." The officer glanced at Max, who was now clinging to Mom. "Your little brother probably saved all of you," he added. I wrapped an arm around Max, still shaking. "You're a hero," I whispered. And for once, Max didn't argue or tease me. Later that night, after the police left, we sat together in the living room, too shaken to return to the table. The leftovers went untouched. I kept thinking about how close we had come to something terrible, how easily the night could have ended differently. The officer's words echoed in my head as I replayed the entire scene over and over. Max, my little brother, the same kid who'd spend hours annoying me, had saved our family. I couldn't stop looking at him, this quiet little hero who didn't even realize what he'd done. After the police left, Dad sat heavily on the couch, his face pale. "I can't believe that just happened," he muttered, rubbing his temples. Mom sat beside him, shaking her head in disbelief. "That poor man," she whispered. "How does someone end up like that? Desperate enough to hold a family at gunpoint?" None of us had answers. We were still in shock, trying to piece together the bizarre events of the night. Dinner was forgotten. The food sat cold and untouched on the table, and the warm, cozy atmosphere that had filled the room just hours before was gone. Max, still shaken, finally spoke up. "Is he going to hurt anyone else?" he asked, his voice small and scared. I wrapped my arm around him, pulling him close. "No, Max," I assured him. "The police caught him. He can't hurt anyone now." But the truth was, I wasn't entirely sure. Could we ever feel safe again, knowing how easily a stranger had infiltrated our lives? Mom, ever the optimist, tried to lift our spirits. "We should be thankful," she said softly, her voice trembling. "Thankful that we're all safe, that no one got hurt." Dad nodded, but I could see the worry in his eyes. "Let's just go to bed," he said. "It's been a long night." We all headed to our rooms, though sleep didn't come easily. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. I kept thinking about the man's eyes, how desperate and dark they had become once the siren started wailing, how quickly someone could turn from being in need to being a threat. I thought about Max again, how brave he had been without even realizing it. Tomorrow I'd tease him as usual, but tonight, all I felt was pride and gratitude. By morning, the terrifying events of the previous night seemed like a distant nightmare. The sun streamed through the windows, and the world outside looked peaceful, as though nothing had changed. But we had changed. There was an unspoken understanding between us now, a deeper bond that comes only from surviving something together. Dad turned on the news during breakfast, hoping for a sense of normalcy, but the top story was the arrest of the man who had terrorized our Thanksgiving. They showed his mugshot. He looked even worse than I remembered. Hollow, haunted eyes stared back at me from the screen. The news anchor mentioned his history of homelessness and mental illness, and my heart ached just a little. He wasn't just a villain, he was a broken man, lost in a world that had given up on him. Max watched silently, his cereal forgotten. "Why did he do it?" he asked suddenly, breaking the quiet. None of us had a good answer. "Sometimes people make bad choices when they're desperate," Mom explained gently. "But that doesn't make it okay." Max seemed to accept her answer, but I could tell the incident had left a mark on him, on all of us. We finished breakfast in silence, each lost in our thoughts. Life went on after that night, but something had shifted. Our family dinners were a little quieter, and we were all a little more cautious. Dad installed new locks on the doors, and Mom took up volunteering at a local shelter, wanting to help those who had fallen on hard times. As for me, I couldn't stop thinking about that Thanksgiving night. It was supposed to be just another holiday filled with food and family, but it became something more. A reminder of how fragile our safety is and how quickly things can change. I kept replaying the moment when the man pulled out the gun, how powerless I had felt, and how in that instant Max had become the bravest person in the room. It's funny, the things you take for granted, the security of home, the comfort of family. After that night, I never took any of it for granted again. We were lucky, so lucky. And every Thanksgiving since, we've said an extra prayer of thanks for each other and for the unexpected hero in our midst. Justin had always been the quiet, somewhat reclusive neighbor. He lived alone in the modest house across the street, with no family to visit or friends ever seen coming by. To the outside world, he appeared perfectly normal, a man of average height with a kind smile and polite demeanor. His loneliness was often overlooked, and people simply assumed he was a bit shy. It wasn't unusual for neighbors to wave at each other or chat briefly in passing, but one Thanksgiving, the quiet man surprised the family by knocking on their door, inviting himself over for dinner. He said that he didn't have anyone to spend the holiday with, and seeing the invitation as a kind gesture, the family agreed to welcome him. At first, Justin's presence seemed harmless. He complimented their cooking, offered to help clean up afterward, and even shared some interesting stories about his past. But as the evening wore on, the family began to feel a growing sense of discomfort. Justin seemed to know far too much about them, details they hadn't shared, secrets only known to close family members. For instance, he asked the father how his business was doing, even though they hadn't talked about it in years. He mentioned the mother's childhood dog, a pet she had loved dearly and lost long ago, and asked about her high school friends by name. The strange thing was, Justin had never been part of their lives before. They had never once discussed such personal matters with him, so how could he know so much? They tried to brush it off, assuming it was just a coincidence, but Justin's behavior only grew more unnerving as the night went on. He started lingering in places where he shouldn't have, hanging around the windows, peeking out into the yard as if he were waiting for something. The family couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. That night, after he left, the father stood at the window watching Justin retreat back to his house. It felt wrong, as if something sinister lurked just beyond the surface of the man's quiet demeanor. Over the next few weeks, Justin's behavior escalated. The family began noticing him more and more. He was always there, whether it was standing at the edge of the yard, sitting on the porch, or watching from behind the bushes. Each time they glanced out the window, he seemed to be there, watching, waiting. It was impossible to ignore. Justin would smile and wave if they made eye contact, as if nothing was wrong. But something inside them screamed that this wasn't the neighborly kindness they had once assumed. One evening, the father decided to confront him. He approached Justin's house, hoping to find some explanation. But when he knocked on the door, Justin didn't answer. Instead, the father saw him through the window, sitting in the dark, staring directly at him. Justin's face was still, his eyes piercing through the darkness, and the father couldn't help but feel that something was terribly wrong. Justin simply didn't move, not even a flinch. The father hurried back home, telling the family that something wasn't right. They all agreed that they had to be more cautious around him. It wasn't just his constant presence. It was the way he seemed to know everything about their lives, even things no one could have known. The unease grew with each passing day. The situation took a darker turn when, one night during a heavy thunderstorm, the mother looked out the window and saw Justin standing in their backyard. The rain was coming down in sheets, but there he was, standing motionless, as if waiting for something. He held something in his hands, something large and dark that looked almost like a weapon. The family's hearts raced in panic. She immediately called the police, her voice shaking as she described what she had seen. By the time the police arrived, Justin had vanished, but they found something troubling in the yard. A small black camera, partially hidden in the bushes. The realization hit them hard. He had been filming them, watching them in their own home without their knowledge. When they questioned Justin later, he was eerily calm and explained that he simply enjoyed observing people, finding comfort in their routine. But that wasn't enough to excuse his actions. Justin was arrested that night, but the damage was done. Though he was taken away, the family's sense of security had been forever shattered. They no longer felt safe in their own home. The man who had seemed so harmless at first was someone else entirely, someone with hidden intentions and a disturbing obsession. They had allowed him into their lives, and in doing so, they had opened the door to someone who would turn their world upside down. Even now, they still look over their shoulders, wondering if anyone else is quietly watching from the shadows. The family farmhouse, though old and weathered, had always been a comforting retreat, a place to escape the hustle and bustle of the outside world. Every Thanksgiving, the narrator's family would gather there, enjoying the warmth of the fireplace and the beauty of the surrounding countryside. The house had been passed down through generations, its creaky floors and charming but eerie atmosphere a part of their heritage. It was a place of tradition, where laughter and love filled the air. But this Thanksgiving, something was different. From the moment they arrived, there was an unsettling feeling in the air, like an invisible presence watching, waiting. The house seemed to breathe with a life of its own, creaking and groaning at odd moments as if responding to their every movement. The wind howled through the cracks in the walls, and the old wood moaned underfoot, amplifying the silence that hung heavy in the air. As the family settled in, the tension began to rise. At first, it was just small things. Strange drafts that chilled the skin, the faint sound of footsteps echoing in the hallway when no one was there. They dismissed it as the usual quirks of an old house, but the atmosphere grew thicker as the day wore on. Jason, the narrator's younger brother, was the first to voice what everyone was beginning to feel. He was usually a brave kid, never one to get scared easily, but this time he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He kept glancing over his shoulder, refusing to go anywhere alone, and insisted that someone else was in the house. At first, the adults laughed it off as childish imagination, until they began to notice it too. The odd noises, the flickering lights, the sudden cold spots in rooms where they had been warm moments before. As night fell, the atmosphere only grew more oppressive. The family gathered in the living room, but even their togetherness couldn't dispel the feeling of dread that hung over them. It was as if something, or someone, was out there, just beyond the edge of their vision. Then the worst happened. In the middle of the night, a loud thud echoed through the house, jolting everyone awake. The sound was so heavy, so forceful, that it seemed to shake the very walls of the farmhouse. The narrator's heart raced in fear, and Jason clung to their side, his face pale with terror. The parents rushed to check on the children, but there was no sign of anything amiss. Still, the sense of unease grew stronger, as though something was watching them from the shadows. Unable to ignore the strange happenings any longer, the narrator decided to investigate the source of the sound. They moved cautiously through the dark house, every creak of the floorboards echoing through the stillness. The house felt colder now, the air thick with tension. When they reached the attic door, they froze. It was slightly ajar, something that had been locked tight when they arrived. With a deep breath, they pushed the door open, and the chill in the air intensified. The attic was dark, save for the faintest glimmer of moonlight streaming through a cracked window. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming now, suffocating. As they moved deeper into the room, a faint whisper echoed from the shadows, too soft to be understood but chilling nonetheless. The narrator's heart raced as they strained to hear, only to realize that the whispers were growing louder, more distinct, as if someone or something was moving closer. Suddenly there was a rustling noise from behind them. The narrator spun around only to find the attic door had slammed shut on its own. Panic set in as they realized they were trapped. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening now, and a cold gust of wind swept through the room, sending a shiver down their spine. Something was there. Something was waiting for them. The terrifying thought crossed their mind. Was it a ghost? Or was there someone hiding in the house, playing some sick game with them? As they struggled to regain control of their breath, the door finally creaked open, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. But the question remained, who or what had been lurking in the shadows all this time? The family would never forget that Thanksgiving night. The farmhouse, once a place of warmth and tradition, had become a haunted relic of terror. Even now, the narrator can't help but wonder if something still watches from the corners of their memories, or if it was all just a twisted game played by something far darker than they could have ever imagined.